Okay, let's begin our panel discussion. Kind of like Q&A, you can ask a question of somebody in particular. You can ask the panel as a whole. And the panel, you're free to decide whether you want to pass the microphone down to anybody or not. So, questions?
Probably the person I would most direct it to is Dr. Preus, but perhaps the whole panel as well as the ACELC. What would you recommend as the best outcome for this synod resolution regarding the disbandment of the CUS?
I hesitate to make a recommendation on that, except for to just realize the financial realities involved here. The LCMS right now is in a $300 million lawsuit with hot chalk over the closing of Portland, Concordia Portland, and that's, I have full faith that the Missouri Synod will prevail in that, but that's a $300 million lawsuit that's still ongoing. And the sorts of liabilities there that are involved in that are simply enormous. I mean, we can't afford $300 million. I think that's 5 times our yearly budget. So those are the economic, financial realities that they're working with, along with, as we've seen the theological realities, and that they are intertwined. I think that realizing that CUS has only existed for 30 years, right? And realizing too that there is another way to keep the Concordias in relation to the Synod makes it just an attractive thing to vote for that resolution, to release the Concordias to their own ownership, but accredit them. It might spell losing 1 or 2 of them, but I just won't finish that sentence.
Next question.
Pastor Brockman from a couple of flyover towns in northwest Kansas. I'd like to hear from all 7 of you fishers of men about the prospect of communing early a young adult who's going through catechism with me right now and is in church every week. Would you commune her early, and how would you do that?
Let me take the opportunity to also clarify something, because Pastor Surburg came up to me and he thought we were in disagreement. We're actually in complete harmony. I do advocate the separation of early communion and confirmation, and I'm in favor in principle of eliminating confirmation, but when you eliminate something that has been practiced, you better have something that replaces the vacuum. Because if you're early communing and someone is communing as a second grader or a third grader, and then you end up having the same type of situation, that's interpreted like confirmation, and then you want to do more catechesis, and then that doesn't happen. So I think this, for pastoral reasons, I would keep confirmation, and you may want to do what Rick Stuckwish does, which is he pushes off confirmation into high school, and let it mark the reception of rich, full catechesis. But what I would advocate, I do not advocate 1 or 2 Saturdays, we're going to have a class for second graders, or we're going to have a class for third graders. It's called early communion class. Then you're in that same situation. They got to know at least the 10 Commandments, the Creed, and the Lord's Prayer. And what Luther means by that is the actual texts of the commandments, the actual text of the Creed, the actual text of the Lord's Prayer, and then how those texts function in the life of the Christian. But the prefaces say, at the very least. So I would advocate, let the children learn at the earliest ages possible the 6 chief parts, primary texts and explanations. When they hunger and thirst and desire the sacrament, their parents desire it for them, then I examine them in the presence of the parents, and I absolve them. They come through private confession, absolution, and they're admitted through the rite of First Communion. Their catechesis continues until they have received the foundational catechesis and so forth. And we've had great success with that, and the same kind of phenomenon that Pastor Surburg was talking about, how the flowery, lofty ceremonial of the confirmation rite is kind of fades away. But the ongoing catechesis is there from First Communion on through whenever confirmation would take place. But I have been, early on in my ministry, I confirmed them at whatever age they learned by heart the catechism, and then you'd have people leaving and they had a loss of catechesis. So the separation of it that's why, I wrote the early communion rite in LSB. I wrote the guidelines for examination for catechumens prior to admission to the Lord's Supper and confirmation. So what's outlined there, and I would use this with your boards of elders and your congregation. Use the LSB agenda, the introduction, the general introduction to all of the membership rites. I wrote that. The introduction to the confirmation, the early communion rite, look at that. And then the guidelines in the Pastoral Care Companion, because those are our official books, and you can go a long way to promoting, I think, good pastoral practice as well as acceptance of this in the congregation. I would also advocate treating children more like adults and adults more like children. So what I mean by that is we baptize the children of our members, but they don't immediately start to commune until they have received and learned by heart and confessed the catechism, and they hunger and thirst for the sacrament. I think that I respect the early church's delay of baptism. However, I don't agree with that practice. I would sooner baptize adult converts earlier, but delay their first communion until there is a grasp of, again, the commandments, the creed, the Lord's Prayer. So in that way, you're treating children and adults in a more similar fashion. Because I don't see any evidence. I know, with all due respect to those exegetes that look at, that say things like, on the day of Pentecost, they didn't need extensive catechesis before baptism because they were already Jews. Well, I just don't buy the argument. They were cut to the heart, they were brought to repentance and faith, and then they were baptized. And pastoral care, pastoral practice is always to serve the cause of faith, which includes ongoing faithful reception of the Lord's Supper. So that's how I would handle that. And in your case, if you've got a 19-year-old and the person, you still have more catechesis that you're going to do, and you think it would serve that 19-year-old well to have a first communion with them, I don't have a problem with that. And then again, you're treating that more like an adult person. If they're 19, they're an adult, more like a child. And so that's what I mean by treating the children like adults and adults like children. Now, I monopolize that question or answer, but...
That's okay. So my take on this is, Lutherans have done this in a different way, and I appreciated especially what Pastor Surburg talked about, the rite of confirmation, because that's a different thing than catechesis. But where I come from is the Book of Concord. I don't know if I think it's in the Apology, where it talks about that the Lutherans do not commune their communicants until they have been absolved and examined. And I think that's actually in 2 places in the Book of Concord. So in terms of readiness for the sacrament, if I do, let's say, and I've always done whatever the congregation does. I've never changed things. But if we do an earlier communion before the complete instruction is done, I need to have that examination, that they understand not just what the Lord's Supper is, but the whole process of atonement behind that and who Jesus is and the nature of... So, there's a whole lot of, maybe it's not the entire catechism, but all the stuff that has to do with salvation and the sacrament. If they can't pass that, they need to finish it. So that's been my practice.
Could you describe the circumstance a little more again?
This gal started coming with her grandma, who was a Lutheran from California, and she's been coming to church since the first of the year, and she's very excited about catechesis, and as a matter of fact, she scolded me last week when I told her I wouldn't be there Tuesday night because of this conference, so I said, okay, let's do it Thursday night. So she comes to church regularly, and she just has a very healthy desire to learn.
And now, obviously, the sixth part is sixth. So, have you already covered the sacrament of the altar? I guess that's the part I don't understand.
Through what she hears in sermons and I guess writings that I have, but we're still on the commandments. So
Yeah, no, I mean.
but she knows the prayer and the creed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess I would say, we use the catechumenate with our adults, and there the pattern is that we usually start in September, and it goes to the Vigil of Easter, and that way we use the church year to catechize. And when people arrive, and we've already started, I always tell them, well, the best way to be learning is by attending church and being in the liturgy, and then in September we'll be ready to start again. And what I found is, early in my ministry, I would always, if someone wants to join the church, I'm very excited, and I'll try to schedule instruction any way I can. And what I found was it tended to create people that you could perceive as members, but it didn't necessarily create members who attended. And so I found that people who want these things are willing to wait to receive them. And so and every pastoral situation is different, but my response would be simply, there's an order to the material, and it's there for a reason, and let's just walk through those things, and we'll get there soon enough, and it will be it'll be a wonderful thing then. So that would be my approach, just simply because there I let the order of the catechism itself guide what I'm doing, and likewise the explanation in the small catechism provides my paradigm that I'm going to follow. So it's one thing to do that if you've already, if you're doing it with a child in a way that is recognizing their abilities to understand it. It's not quite as extensive, but here, if you're dealing with someone who is more of an adult who can fully understand these things, then I would want to give them the full thing that I would normally give, and just arrive at that point. Now, what I have done, and this is on baptism, you baptism forth, and once someone learns about baptism, if they haven't been baptized, they're like, well, I want to be baptized. And as much and as cool as it is to do baptisms at the Vigil of Easter, I just can't in good conscience tell them, no, you have to wait. So I've done that in terms of, but at that point, it's a little bit different. Obviously, it's not also examination for the sacrament. So I think following the text of the Catechism and following the text of the small Catechism is just a fundamentally good thing to do, and encouraging people to look at it in those ways.
I wanted to follow up on the apologies comment that Marty mentioned. We don't admit anyone to the sacrament who has not first been examined and absolved. And we were addressing this question. There was a member on the board, on the agenda committee, that argued that it was an examination in the narrow sense of just, do they know they're sinners and do they believe in Jesus, kind of thing. But John Viker translated a letter from Luther, and it's in a Concordia journal, 1990, somewhere in that vicinity. And in this letter, and the letter is dated around 1530. So you got the context of the Augsburg Confession and its apology, and he outlines very specifically the kinds of questions to be asked in examination. So it really gives strong evidence that it's more than just a minimalistic set of questions that like you're asking in the confessional about their sin and do they trust in Jesus, but it is a more doctrinal examination.
So are some of those questions in the back of the companion that you...
Well, I think the Christian questions with their answers gives you the paradigm. But here, Pastor Surburg and I are on the same page with this. You know, if you have someone who's 19, is she a member of your congregation? Is a baptized? See, I would want that person to be under my baptismal care. When are they coming in? If they're a 16-year-old that's been baptized at some point in the future, and they're in the congregation, you know, you have to examine all of the context of all of these questions, you know.
The specific question that Pastor Porath had asked at the end of the last session was for you, Dr. Preus. I was just curious in terms of having an opportunity to teach roughly 18 to 22-year-olds after a world of catechesis and formation has already happened. In a classical model, does that presuppose a classical worldview for those students through their elementary and high school ages to thrive in your context as well?
That's a great question. So certainly the impetus for Luther Classical College comes not only because we need a conservative Lutheran college, but also because there is a classical movement, represented well by the CCLE, and the new schools that are popping up, the new parochial schools that are popping up all across the LCMS are all classical. So that is, you could say, the wave of the future. However, classical gets thrown around a lot, and a lot of times, people just think it means you learn some Latin and throw some rhetoric in there, and and ancient literature and things like that. But I really liked what Dr. Kuntz said in a recent banquet speech, where he said, Luther Classical College, we need to support it. And he said, but really we could just call it Luther College, because all classical means is sane and wise, right? And so I say that in answer to your question that someone could go through a different style of education, which would be inferior to a classical education, and yet still be reasonably conservative, Christian, read some good books and so forth, and then come to Luther Classical College and might not be as easy. I don't know. I think if you're conservative, if you're Lutheran and you come, Thucydides is going to appeal to you, right? And learning logic and philosophy and rhetoric is going to appeal to you, and reading through the entire Bible is going to appeal to you. If you love to read, if you love Lutheran theology, and you love to sing Lutheran hymns, you're halfway there to classical.
Hi, Vicar Thomas Goodroad. I'm with Good Shepherd Lutheran Church in Lincoln, Nebraska. I've got a question primarily for Pastor Johnson. First, I want to thank you for your paper. Excellent paper. Page 6, I read, and I quote here, because Lutheran schools are often not available, homeschooling and home catechesis provides an outstanding environment to guide and instruct our children and promote unity in the church. Now that makes it sound like you would prefer Lutheran school to send your kids to. Later on, same paragraph, page 6, it says, while the pastor is given great responsibility to equip the saints, it is truly the parents who are best equipped to teach their children. So that raises the question for me. If you had your druthers, in the best case scenario, there was a good Lutheran school nearby, or you were equipped and prepared to teach your own kids at home, what would your personal preference be?
Has he passed his vicarage interviews yet?
Yeah, Lutheran schools, when they are still confessionally Lutheran in their doctrine and practice and unashamedly so, then I think that those are a viable place to send your kids. On the other hand, I think it is true that they just aren't available. So for, I think, the vast majority of us, the only real option is homeschooling. So you say best case scenario, and that was an option. I would lean towards homeschooling for one reason, in that, you know, even in a Lutheran school, you're still turning your education over to perceived professionals or perceived experts. I hope I said that correctly. In sending your kids to a Lutheran school, and so I still think that it is preferable to take responsibility for your own children's education if you want to make sure that they're getting what you want them to learn, and every parent is capable of doing that. I just think that is, yeah, I would say homeschooling is preferable. But you know, there are certainly people who are not able to have one of the parents stay home to allow that, and in that case, I think the Lutheran school system would certainly be a good option if that Lutheran school is still unashamedly Lutheran. So did I dance around that enough, or did I sort of get the? Okay, thanks.
Just to follow up on that, I've spoken in several different locations on the topic I did today, and I've some of those presentations raised the questions: are, somewhat provocatively, are Lutheran schools the worst thing that happened to catechesis? In the sense that you have created this thing and you said it's your job. And you create this mentality among parents that I send them to the Lutheran school, therefore I don't have to worry about this. In fact, I am experiencing a situation in my parish right now where someone has come from a parochial school, and it is like a shock that we expect the parents to come to catechesis and be involved in it, because that used to be I sent them to school. I didn't have to worry about it. And so that's, you know, Lutheran schools can be really, really good, and I know some that are really excellent. I obviously know some that are not so great. But at a fundamental level, that's one question that I struggle with a little bit, is just that whole dichotomy that you set up, that it's there, it's going to have not my problem anymore. And I think that makes it very easy for parents to kind of just check out on, you know, their responsibility.
Well, not disagreeing. I think a good Lutheran school is preferable to homeschool. That is an actual disagreement. Well, not disagreeing, I disagree. No, but I do agree with the point. I mean, the parents have to be involved, right? And all a good Lutheran school is, or should be, is an extension of the Christian home. And so we should purposefully set up our schools so that there is parental involvement. Now, that being said, like, I can't, or my wife can't give to my sons what Pastor Richard, who is the headmaster and their 6th through 12th grade teacher, can give them. She simply can't. He's brilliant, and he's a male figure that they look up to and respect, and I don't have the time to do that at home either, because I've got a job. And so I don't think that we want to underestimate the great benefits of a Lutheran school and the, not expertise, but just the talents that we have of confessional Lutheran teachers, male and female, but especially from what I've seen in my personal experience, pastors who have just had a tremendous influence on my own kids, that I don't think if we homeschooled them it would be as good as we have it at Mount Hope. Yes.
Luther provides some direction of his own also, not only in the large catechism, where he speaks about a father training up his son at home, and then when the father is unable to do that anymore for whatever reason, he just goes on and says, then the father enlists a schoolmaster. Also, in Luther's sermon on keeping children in schools, he outlined several reasons why it is that families may not be able to educate their children at home. And some of those you've heard right here. Sometimes it's also because as you, I think, get into the certain subject matter, it behooves us to maybe think about the old tutorial system, having someone who knows a lot about that, who is a confessional Lutheran, who can teach your children. And while our school partners with homeschools, supports homeschools, I think it's a great partnership between the two of us. I also think that for me and my wife, we homeschooled for 8 years. And part of what brought me back into schools is the realization that perhaps there are talents and abilities that I as a pastor have that might be of service not only to my children, but also to an entire congregation. And I think we have a lot of talented home educators who would be of great service in the Lutheran school. We have partnered with some of those parents because we don't require state teaching certification. You just need to be a solid Lutheran and know what it is that you are teaching children. And I think that relationship becomes much more organic then when you have that kind of a situation between home and school.
I'm a college student going to one of the colleges that the Rev. Preus mentioned, and your description hit pretty hard about the declining culture of Lutheran heritage as opposed to marketing more broadly to a more worldly catechesis. What advice would you have for students who are essentially caught in the middle where that culture is declining at those colleges, but those students won't be able to go to LCC? Would you have any advice of how to mitigate that culture or maybe even reverse it to an extent, or what would you say?
Yeah, absolutely. So all three of my teachers at Mount Hope Lutheran School, besides Pastor Richard, so the three that came from Concordia Mequon, and they had an excellent education, and they had a pocket of friends that they deliberately is it hung out with? All right. They went to a particular church that was especially Orthodox, liturgical, where the pastor preached great sermons. They did devotions together, so forth and so on. And so I think that's what you have to do is find that pocket and be deliberate about it, surrounding yourself with fellow confessional Lutherans. And I think that it kind of depends on what your major is too. But if you're, if you would be interested in going to Luther Classical College, but you can't because you're too old, then you would probably be taking the sorts of classes anyway that more confessionally minded students would be taking. And so that would be my encouragement. Find the best, even if you have to drive a little bit, the best Lutheran church you can find, where they take seriously the liturgy, where you hear good preaching, and then bring your friends. And surround yourself with as many confessional Lutherans as possible.
Which Concordia?
None.
That you go to?
Bethany.
Oh, you go to Bethany. Okay. I think in our Concordias, certainly it's true of River Forest, my alma mater, there is a Lutheran subculture on the Lutheran College. And
It's true.
it's true.
I vouch for it, it's true.
So when the Capella came to Peace in Sussex this last year, you look down all of the members of the choir. I think, with one exception, they were all LCMS church work students. So that's where you find, they have their devotions at choir before every concert. They're the ones going to chapel. They're in the music program. They're in church work vocations. At CUW, you have a lot of the same kind of thing, and they tie in exactly, as Dr. Preus said, with particularly Luther Memorial in Shorewood, Wisconsin, where Pastor Michael Larson is the pastor, and they serve as a campus ministry for UWM students, for Marquette University students, and for CUW students. And they've got several faculty members from the theology department that are members and assist in the liturgy there. So that's, I think, the best case scenario under the current circumstance.
One other thing, it has been an honor to listen to all the lectures, and your papers were very well written and thought-provoking, but I was kind of disappointed on one error that you all kind of consistently made, because you're all Lutheran pastors, and so you've been well briefed on justification, but all of your papers are like left-aligned. None of them are center-justified. So they're all just uneven on the edges. Just a thought for the future.
That was the formatting.
Pastor Kieser, when going through your presentation the other day, and by the way, God bless all of you, I've enjoyed all of them. At the bottom of page 9, you talk about there are Lutheran schools that are needed today, even in every generation. And you talked about young boys are to be taught to be husbands and fathers. Young girls are to be taught to be wives and mothers. At the risk of sounding trite, is there such a curricula?
Is there such a curricula?
Yes. Is there some set of courses or a particular course that Faith Plano teaches?
Oh, I see what you're saying. We don't have a class on being a woman or a class on being a man. But I think that what we do does suggest what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. I'll give you an example. We have teas, where you come for tea. The young men dress in jackets and ties, and the young women dress in dresses. And the young men come prepared to lead conversation. And the young women also are included in this. So, you know, one place to learn about being a man and one place to learn about being a woman is, for instance, at a table. But as far as do we have a curriculum that addresses that in particular, the answer is no.
I slightly misspoke. I meant to say husband, wives, mothers, fathers. You have a curriculum that teaches a person to be a good father.
Table of duties.
Outside of I think these things just happen in the way you live out your life within the school as opposed to having it as a class. So the example that I gave would be an example that I think that is important. I mean, what are men? Men are to be initiators. Men are to be providers. I mean, these things that we think about when we think of manhood, and then also, you know, what does it mean to be a woman? And so when these things are played out, having boys play against girls is not a good idea. I mean, it's just not a good idea. So some of the decisions that we make, on the other hand, the fruit of this is that we have had several already from our high school be married. So you can find a good Lutheran spouse within. I think it requires that we hire men and women who understand their God-given rules, and this is lived out in, some people have called it the hidden curriculum or maybe the unspoken curriculum, but it's just the way in which you organize your life within the school, I think, teaches more about that than maybe a class. But maybe a class is a good idea. I also think that in studying the virtuous pagans, there's a lot there on manhood there's a lot to be said about a man who travels the world but his desire is to be back with his wife. And you can just go through account after account, I think, in the virtuous pagan literature and the scriptures, and also study these things. And these things can be pulled out as you're walking through that literature as well.
Yeah, amen. That's exactly right. But the classical literature is just ripe with this. I mean, he obviously just referenced Odysseus coming home to Penelope and leaving everything behind. He wants to go home. He leaves goddess after goddess. And a good teacher, that's the other thing, is you get the good teachers who are not only going to live that, but then also teach it. It's second nature to them. Of course, if you're going to talk about Odysseus, if you're going to be teaching the Odyssey, you're going to teach about marriage and family in a conservative way, and urge wives to be wives. Penelope is an excellent example. She remains faithful for 20 years to Odysseus and cares for her house, and she's wise. She's just a wonderful example. And of course, the biblical ones. Ruth is just fantastic. Esther's fantastic, actually. Esther should be like a textbook because she's not only beautiful, Esther, but she's also very wise, respectful, courageous. She's just a wonderful a paragon of female virtue. The other thing I was going to mention is that what we do at our school is we have captains, and they're basically heads of their houses, because we divide different. I think we got that from your school, actually. The house policy, where you divide people into different houses, and yeah, I've never read them. The heads, it's not classical enough for me. So the heads of the houses, then, they meet with Pastor Richard, and they eat lunch with him once a week, and he reads them some classical literature, some biblical literature, and then discusses it with them and teaches them what it means to be a man on specific issues. And they do the same thing with women, young ladies, with the female teachers, and so they eat lunches with them. So there's certain things you can do to encourage that sort of thing that's not necessarily in the curriculum, but kind of extracurricular.
Well, we don't have a school, but there's formal, as you've discussed, and there's informal. And what I mean by the informal is this. The children watch and they observe, especially the pastor and his wife, and they watch how they relate to one another. So this is anecdotal, but it's just for fun to talk about it. So I've had several calls over the years to go somewhere else and serve. And I always ask for input from the congregation, whether to stay or go. What's been interesting, and it's a common theme, the children write me the letters. And the children have said this repeatedly, and I'm not joking. Please stay, and one of the reasons why we want you to stay is because we love how you and Mrs. Kuhlman model for us how to be a husband and a wife and a mother and a father. And so they're always watching us, and they're learning. And so I also then try to formally teach in our congregation that to all our families, husbands and wives, moms and dads, is that the kids are watching you make holy marriage and family attractive, because they don't see very many good examples. You're looking at a bunch of them up here, I suppose, probably.
Next question.
Thank you all for your presentations, Pastor Alexander Blank and Winside and Carroll. My first question is for you, Pastor Surburg, regarding early communion. Recently, in our last confirmation, I was able to get a 6th grader confirmed, and even with that, I had some struggle. I have a few young children in my congregation that I'm hoping to get to early communion, including my own daughter, who's already asking at the age of 5, thanks be to God. I have been able to get my elders on board, so my question is about the general education of the congregation as a whole. What do you see as the best opportunities to do that? Is that in preaching? Is that in a congregational meeting? Where do you see the best opportunity?
First question, do you have every Sunday communion?
Yes, and
Okay.
Wednesday.
Okay, that's a good start. Our people, like many of our pastors, are largely ignorant of our history. And so I think that's one place to start. Church newsletters, opportunities in the congregation to teach about what has been the practice, that just because you've seen it done here in 7th and 8th grade, and that's when people started receiving, has not historically always been the way Lutherans did it. And in fact, it's always really helpful to say that's not the way Luther did it. I mean, so because much of it is trying to just get people to sort of unlearn what they think is true because we've always done it this way. Now that's a very powerful argument to try to overcome, but I mean ultimately, and then along with that, helping them see that to what extent can any of us truly understand, the mystery of the sacrament? We can know the content of those questions and understand that, but this is still an article of faith, and the faith of a 6, 7, 8-year-old. Their ability, as long as, and you have to affirm and be very careful that we are doing catechesis on all 6 parts. They have to have an understanding of what not just knowing these texts by heart, but what they mean, at least to be able to understand them in a general way from the small catechism. I mean, we're talking about all those things, but if we can achieve all those things with this child, then their ability, how is it your ability to understand the supper is going to be superior, to that of the 6, 7, or 8-year-old who confesses it's Jesus' true body and blood. It takes time, it takes patience, but I think those are two sides. One is the history of confirmation itself. It's just get people to understand it has not always been this way, and in fact in Early Lutheran it wasn't this way. And then secondly, to get them to understand that the nature of faith itself in what the gift is as long as we're going to have the other catechesis going along with it, it's not like somehow you're superior to this child and their ability to understand it. And so at least that's what I would approach it. Any other thoughts?
Here again, I would work towards encouraging the wonderful reception by heart of the text of the Catechism at the earliest ages possible. And you're going to have parents who want this for their children. So if you've got Johnny that knows the 10 Commandments and their explanations by heart, along with the Creed and the Lord's Prayer, the other sections of the Catechism, and you can examine them, then for me, this has been the greatest thing to bring to others in the congregation. So, do you believe that you're a sinner? Yes, I believe it. How do you know this? From the 10 Commandments. What are the 10 Commandments? And then they can recite them. What do the 10 Commandments show you? My sin. What have you deserved? I deserve God's punishment. Do you also have the hope to be saved? Yes, in whom do I trust? In whom do you trust? Well, Jesus, what has he done for you? You trust in him. He died for me and shed his blood for me. Where is that found? In the Creed. Do you know the Creed? Can you say that? And then they confess the Creed. And why do you pray? Because I believe in Jesus. And my Heavenly Father, I have access, I pray to him because I believe in Jesus. Do you know the Lord's Prayer? And they say the Lord's Prayer. What does he give you in the Lord's Supper? Well, he gives me his true body and blood. How do you know that? Because he says, this is my body, this is my blood. So if you have a kid that's in 3rd grade that can do what I just did in examination with their parents who want the sacrament for them and they want it, then I defy any elder or any other member to say, oh, they shouldn't be communing. Well, then I want you to sit down and I'm going to ask you the same questions. And so I do not start with theory. I start with concrete person in the pew, little kid, knows the catechism, knows his sin, knows his Savior, knows those 6 chief parts, hungers and thirsts for the sacrament. I'm sorry, I'm bound, from my point of view, I'm bound by God to give him the Lord's Supper. Anyway, I'm sorry. I'll try to be a little stronger the next time.
I disagree. Just kidding.
Pastor Tyson Bibb, Trinity Lutheran Church, Northern Missouri. Have a great joy of serving the saints there. They're in a situation where they didn't have kids for a long time. A lot of the kids that come back, it's an agricultural community. Sons are coming back, taking up the father's farm, having kids. We're blessed with a ton of kids for a congregation that worships 80 on a Sunday. But a lot of these boys don't know how to catechize their children. And I'm at the outset of beginning to teach these young men, these young fathers and husbands, how do you do this in the home? And I can relate to them what I do with my own children who are 7, 3.5, and 8 weeks old. But I'm just wondering, just for the panel, what are some helpful forms or very basic, simple text, things that I can put in front of them? They'd be open to me coming to their homes, most of them, and even having dinner and doing this in front of them so they can see it and take it up themselves. But I guess I would like some more resources myself as a pastor, because I didn't have that growing up, and I feel like I had to kind of just, my wife and I just said, we're gonna do it, you know. So I'd like your wisdom.
Well,
thank you for your presentations.
Well, the obvious answer, again, I'm Captain Obvious. You have the small catechism. That's your resource right there for the men. As the head of the household should teach it to his family. So if you need to model that, do it. Take your fathers out or have a Bible study or whatever, and just model it for them. Okay, you're going to sit with your family and you have a conversation. What, do you know the 10 Commandments, Sonny? No, let's learn them. And you just start, just do it. That, and for my money, that's it. If the kids don't know how to pray, Dad's going to teach them. You've got it in the catechism. It's all right there, small catechism. Captain Obvious.
Do these fathers come to Bible class? Okay. So it's becoming, I think, more and more popular to like begin Bible class and Sunday school together. So you have like a Sunday school opening in front of the Bible class.
Starting that.
That's a brilliant thing.
Very good example of that in my vicarage congregation, and I thought about bringing that in.
Yeah, and it's usually very well received because people love to see the kids. And you can model a 3-minute devotion there. So what I do usually is maybe talk about the gospel for the day, otherwise say, okay, let's go through the 10 Commandments, or let's go through the creed, or pick a certain commandment and do the meaning, especially if it has to do with the sermon. And then I teach them a hymn, and I do Luther's morning prayer. And so we'll have a hymn for like the season, so it'll last 3 months maybe. We're teaching this hymn. It's always, I try to pick hymns that are Lutheran, but also pretty, familiar, like easier to sing, like 2 verses, like praise to you and adoration. Of course, that's Kingo, and he's a Dane, so that's awesome.
Just to piggyback on that and to say a little bit more. So I'm doing this intentionally as well without them even knowing it. And as Christian mentioned, it's the Sunday school opening with the students and the adults, both parents and all the other adults who are there. Now, Poppy's witnessed this in action, and maybe some of you. Micah, you've been there, haven't you, when I've done this? So we have a Sunday school opening. We have the versicles from Matins, the 10 Commandments. We have the creed. Then we have a memory verse, and maybe it's a portion of the catechism. We sing a hymn that fits with the season, the church, or etc. So at Trinity Murdoch, without them even knowing it, I've been doing this. And so when I go on hospital calls, when I go on home visits, Kuhlman immediately says, now let's pray. And here's how it goes. Oh, Lord, open my lips. And they're immediately in it. And then I immediately go into the creed and the commandments, and they're immediately doing it. And these parents are saying, I'm doing this now at home, Pastor. Yeah.
I have one more question. Pastor Johnson, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to add to theirs. I think a good resource is to make sure they have hymnals in their home. And, you could encourage them to either sing or read the hymn of the day for that week or that coming week. use that as your devotion. Just read through I mean, if you're not comfortable singing in the home, although you got internet, you can always Google it and watch it on Facebook YouTube or something and sing along that way. But yeah, use the hymnal and use those hymns as devotional guides. Yep.
Table full of Captain Obvious is here. Go ahead, Pastor Surburg.
And just one resource that I found to be just wonderful for using with younger children in terms of just biblical text, and the exact title is, but it's the CPH Lutheran Story Bible, whatever it is. The text, it's basic enough for a child, but it's really, really close to the actual biblical text. And the illustrations are really wonderful. I mean, that's what we used with our children when they were younger as the Bible reading portion of our devotions. And so whenever parents ask me for a resource, what can I use, Pastor, because we want to start, with a really young child exposed to the Bible, that's the thing I always point them to.
Okay, we're going to have one final question.
Mark Kranz, Excelsior Springs, Mount Calvary Lutheran Church. And I guess this would be for the whole panel, and it's a bit of a follow-up from an earlier question, and Pastor Bender already kind of went in the direction. But when it comes to the overall catechesis structure within the church, so not just the examination necessarily, but the entire concept of it, and then ultimately leading to examination and hopefully getting towards something along the lines of First Communion, to what degree, well, I should put it this way, at the risk of sounding less than pastoral, should the body of the congregation, the voters, if you will, really have anything to say about how we do it if our goal is to teach these kids to know Jesus? Does my question make sense, or do I need to explain it a little more? Like, how much permission do you need to teach the faith and examine them, right?
I'm very passionate about these things, as you can tell, because I'm not the, what did you call it, the academicians, or academitis, yeah. Because what I do, everything is geared toward what's going to best serve the cause of faith. So I don't think the voters have any responsibility here at all, other than insisting that their pastor, preach and teach according to the scriptures and the confessions. But I think the whole context, this is why I mentioned something like, and it doesn't have to be what I call it, the congregation at prayer, but to establish a culture of catechesis and prayer in the congregation, where you're constantly doing what the other brothers have talked about, modeling, where you have, whether it's the Matins type introduction with the creed and so forth, where you're giving devotional and catechetical materials to the congregation every week, and you're exploring with them, modeling with them how to do it, introducing it to them, and that becomes the context in which any catechesis class would take place. I would also recommend for adults, I insist that an adult catechumen knows by heart the commandments and the creed and the Lord's Prayer and the primary texts on the sacraments before being admitted to the Lord's Supper. That's part of what I meant by treating adults like children and children like adults. So I really do. I want to hear them recite those texts word for word. You shall have no other gods. You shall not misuse the name of the Lord your God, and so forth. As well as then, how are those texts used? So,
how do you do that? How do you test them? Do you say, "I'll say it with you"? Wow.
No, I meet. We'll have a. I also should say this. I have gone away from. I no longer have what I call didache, which is my adult catechesis. And it's typically 24 weeks or longer, typically an hour and a half sessions. No longer is that simply a class. Now it's always in the context of what I call the divine service for catechesis. So I literally, robed, vested, stole, will begin with a hymn, invocation, and collect assigned for that reading, for that day's material. And then there's a biblical narrative that teaches the catechism. And I will catechize them for an hour. In the nave, it's interactive, it's engaging, and it culminates with the confession of sins, prayer proper preface, verba, celebration of the sacrament, because I always want to have sponsors in the congregation for new members. So those new members who are not yet communing are getting their catechesis in the context of a divine service for catechesis. And it has created a much greater hunger and thirst for the sacrament, an understanding of catechesis not fundamentally as some body of knowledge that has to be learned. I will never go back to having the adult instruction not in the context of that divine service, and to be vested and so forth. And with this, I would also say, now, I don't have this published yet for everybody, but I have prayers, a catechism prayer book, which has several prayers on each of the 10 commandments, each of the articles of the creed, each of the petitions of the Lord's Prayer, each of the sections under baptism, confession of the keys, the sacrament of the altar, and prayers on several on all of the table of duties. When you learn by heart the catechism, and you're reciting the catechism, which we encourage everybody to do across the congregation from cradle to grave, and then you have prayers which we put on the catechism, like this week, it's the 5th petition, and forgive us our trespasses. Heavenly Father, I'm unworthy of the things for which I pray. I don't deserve them. I ask that you would give them all to me by grace, for I daily sin much and surely deserve nothing but punishment. Grant me by your grace also to sincerely forgive and gladly do good to those who sin against us. When you teach the catechism in that way, to learn it by heart and then turn it into a prayer, it has a radically different impact on what the catechism is, and it helps to actually give an example and a pattern of what Luther would advocate as the catechism is the prayer book and the handbook of the Christian faith and life. And the reception of that, those prayers on the catechism, which each week I include in the congregation at prayer, whatever the catechism is for the week, has caused the adult members of the congregation to renew their memorization of the catechism and appreciate it that much more. And so,
what you've just observed is what Wilhelm Leah said, and nobody knows what he's talking about, is that the Luther Small Catechism is the only catechism that can be prayed. Right. You can't pray the Heidelberg Catechism. You can't pray the Baltimore Catechism. But you've just learned what Leah was talking about right there in about a 2-minute speech. Right there, bingo. That's how you do it.
It's more fun than a pastor should be allowed to have.
I think one of the things to recognize is we want to weave the small catechism into as many aspects of congregational life as we can. So, for example, we have the same dear woman that once the Lord calls her home, we won't be doing confirmation banners anymore. She made banners for each of the 6 parts. So whatever part of the catechism we are doing that currently on the right side of church, that's what's hanging there. And then every time we change, I say, oh, you see, well, now we're on the next part, you know. And on the back of our bulletin, every single Sunday, there's a learn by heart text. It's the catechism text, small catechism text that is for the coming Wednesday, and we have the whole congregation read it together. So every single, and then we get to the summer, we go through the table of duty. I mean, it's just, I think any possible way that you can weave it into congregational life. I need to learn more about what you're doing because that's awesome. I think we need to do. Yeah, absolutely.
Let's thank the panel.